Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Margarete Windisch. I'm a PhD student at ETH Center for Law and Economics, and I will moderate today's workshop. So like the last one after a long but very interesting day. And I would also like to welcome our guests, Katja Langenbucher and Ben Green. They will each present their recent paper on AI for about 20 minutes, and we'll have time after each presentation for questions. And our first presenter is Katja Langenbucher on the topic AI as a product. And she's a law professor at Goethe University's House of Finance in Frankfurt, affiliate professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and long-term guest professor at
freezing. It's Fordham Law School. Sure, you want me to start or I'm open. Oh, I lost. Would you like me, Elliot? Would you give me?
Yes, I think we lost Margarita. Ben, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here as well.
Okay, great. Katja, I would say go ahead and
good.
But also you might be able to share screen now.
Ah, that would be cool. Yes, so that is good.
Great.
Okay. So good. Okay, so I am going to talk about AI as a product, and I will use the general question, how should we regulate AI? So we're picking it up where the last panel stopped, what is about law and AI to be learned, and I'm taking the European Commission's proposal for an AI Act as an example, and more concretely, I'm using algorithmic credit scoring as a test case for what they propose in their idea for this AI Act. So a couple of quick things. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the proposal. So the proposal follows a top-down approach, which means there's common normative standards which the Commission would like to apply to all high-risk systems, so sort of across the board. I would like to focus, as you will see, on high risk, what the Commission calls high risk. They do follow what they call risk-based approach, and they have three categories singled out. They have prohibited uses of AI, they have high risk, which, as I said, I will focus on, systems, and then they have kind of normal, simple, they don't have a name for that, the others, so to speak. And for those others, there's only transparency obligations. Now, high-risk systems, what do they entail? They have a list of mandatory requirements users will need to obey. And the idea is as long as they don't pose unacceptable risk. So clearly, the notion of risk and how to deal with it is the key. And my feeling, and what that will be my recurring critique throughout this little presentation, is that I feel the Commission's proposal reminds me sort of a product regulation, you know, like putting a car on the market and checking whether the brakes work or whether the steering wheel does what it's supposed to do, rather than other questions. And I say rather than other questions because as soon as we're talking about AI or conceptualizing it as such a thing as a risky product, obviously what we will need is a benchmark to say, this is what's risky, this is what's not risky, and this is what you should be looking for. And so it's interesting to understand what the European Commission says is the risk it's concerned about. Because remember, we have the three categories, kind of normal, prohibited, and high risk. And so risk is at the center of what this proposal is about. And so here we read, that's recital 27, an AI system is identified as high risk if it has harmful impact on health, okay, safety, fine with that, and fundamental rights of persons in the union. And this is what I will be criticizing throughout the presentation. I'm absolutely fine with risk as a quality benchmark if it concerns health. I'm fine with AI, which trying to detect melanoma. We can say, okay, the AI is good. If it detects a lot of them, it's not so good if it gives us a lot of false positives. I'm also sort of fine with safety, talking about self-driving cars and stuff like that. If the car hits the wall all the time, it's probably not a good AI. If we're talking about fundamental rights, I'm much less confident about this being a good idea for regulation and for turning the question to what extent it should be regulated on the question of, is it risky to fundamental rights? So, it's so broad and I have 20 minutes. So I'm going to focus on one test case, which is algorithmic credit scoring. The proposal has focused on it, interestingly enough, without this being in the white paper, without this being in the high-level expert report. So it's kind of spawned now. And why does it say it's risky? It says discrimination of persons or groups perpetuate historical patterns of discrimination or create new forms of discriminatory impacts. Most of you who've been working on AI know all of that. That's just the next to saying that that's it. And now my main problem with the proposal is that there's really a lot of uncertainty about how to deal with algorithmic discrimination in general, credit scoring more specifically, and there's no established EU law on that point. So why does the proposal not offer any guidance? Really quickly, introducing you what is credit scoring. You know what a credit score is, I would suppose. Historically, we were seeing loan decisions based on a mix of information, some qualitative, some quantitative. Obviously, that didn't usually work all that well. We had cognitive errors, we had biases, we had all kinds of things. Then we saw in many countries, such as, for example, Germany, where I'm from, for example, the US, we saw agencies which were specifically doing nothing else but credit scoring. Interestingly, from the European perspective, not every country has that. France doesn't have these credit scoring agencies. Austria doesn't have them, for example. And so obviously what we're focusing on here are not the old ones, but the novel scoring agencies. What do? They expand the input variables to produce a variety of alternative scores. So they collect all kinds of data. They collect web browser data, what did you do at Amazon? Where's your computer based, Facebook friends, typos, it's all kinds of things, and I could talk about that forever. And then you produce correlations between those broad input data and a definition of success, usually probability of paying back the entire loan, but it could also be different definitions of success if we're maybe thinking about a payday loan, for example, where you need to pay back only a bit and still the lender will make a profit. So this algorithmic scoring has been discussed a lot in the US, not so much in the EU. So I'm just, running you through it really quickly, and I'm very happy to go into detail if you have questions on specific areas of this. So it's good algorithmic credit scoring for a lot of what people call credit invisible, and I am happy for the good case to give my own example. When I first went to New York and tried to open a bank account, nobody would want to have me because I wasn't able to produce the typical credit scores. So yes, for some of them, it's a good business case because they get people like me who could easily open a bank account in my own country, but not somewhere else. It also does have, although there I'm much more skeptical, some potential for inclusion. So if we're looking at the global south, there might be, and happy to talk about this in more detail later, there might be promises, but then the concerns we'll focus on include quite a number. Data privacy is a huge concern. Then we have explainability, institutional design of regulators, and what the EU proposal focuses on non-discrimination. Two ideas or two examples for discrimination. One, which, from the AI world, we all know, historic bias. So this is an example from a study which has been run by this NGO down here. So they were creating identical borrower profiles, and the only way they were distinguishable were they went to different universities. Now this is a predominantly Black one, this is a predominantly Hispanic one, and you see how the cost varies between these two applicants. So familiar, you're all with historic bias, saying there's an interesting new study which claims that it's not even correctable via this just changing sort of the output, right? Because with the historic bias, you could always say, well, we'll do some kind of AI affirmative action, we'll just change it a little bit, we'll take the result and kind of give an extra score to those we feel are being discriminated against. And now this new study says, no, this is not going to work because there's a problem of noisy data. So the problem with minority and low income groups really is they just have less data. So we can't really score them because they don't produce what the normal scoring agency would look at. And so in that sense, the AI won't help us. Because the prediction will be distorted in both ways. It might be too good, it might be too bad, and we won't be able to tell because we don't have the data. So that was one thing with the general problems AI poses in all kinds of areas. The other thing is, what does the law says? Because again, remember, the EU proposal ties the question to what extent we should regulate it to the question, does it pose a risk for fundamental human rights? So as to credit scoring, we'll need to read that as a risk of discrimination. And then we need to understand, well, discrimination is a legal term. So do we know what the law has to say as to algorithmic discrimination? So we would need to talk about the legal basis. There's the Charter of Fundamental Human Rights, but then there's the question, does this apply in a private law context? Because after all, we're talking about a lender and a borrower, so a private loan contract. There's a couple of directives, but none of them talks about credit scoring. Also, maybe because credit scoring is nothing which is established across the European Union. And there is some member state law, yes, in Germany, not in other countries. And interestingly, I like to draw the comparison to the US because the US has had scoring agencies for a very long time and has also dealt with discrimination in scoring and in lending for a very long time. So from the 70s area of the civil rights movement, there's ECOA, Equal Credit Opportunities Act, which provides for specific legal remedies if you're being discriminated against in the lending context. So legal basis is one question. Another question is, what type of discrimination are we talking about after all? So there might be kind of the evil guy who trains his or her AI to detect the guy he doesn't want to borrow to. This is really unlikely because, they want to make a profit after all. So what we're probably going to be talking about is not direct discrimination, but indirect discrimination. So that's the no credit for part-time workers, sort of knowing that part-time workers are women mostly, or maybe only talking about what's called statistical discrimination, because after all, the AI will be trained to single out those groups which will present a worse profile in terms of creditworthiness. So is this discrimination at all in legal terms? Or is it just picking out the ones which I would like to borrow to? And then lastly, the defenses. Europeans would look for the general appropriateness tests, so that would be legitimate aim, appropriate and necessary means. The US has a similar test, no alternative practice, and a manifest business necessity. So all of this is really only there to say it's really complicated, right? It's technically really complicated to understand where we understand as discrimination comes from and to what extent it could be remedied in the AI. Legally, it's also really complicated because there's books written about algorithmic discrimination and how we need to understand it. On top of that, there's the credit scoring discrimination context, which is also far from clear legally. So in the absence of that guidance, the proposal jumps ahead and says, oh, it's a risk to fundamental human rights, which we don't talk about. But anyway, here are my compliance requirements for which you don't have a benchmark, but we'll see about that. So that's the compliance requirements the proposal gives us. It talks about quality of data sets, technical documentation, transparency, human oversight, robustness. And all of this sounds really good, and I have nothing against all these nice things. My question is, how well do they fit together with mitigating human rights concerns? So just out of the list of all these requirements, taking, for example, quality of data sets. So this is from recital 44. So here the suggestion is, well, data sets really should be relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete. So sure, it's true that sometimes the problem of discrimination in the credit scoring context is a problem of sloppy data. That's true. Sometimes data is just plain wrong. And that's been the case earlier for just the normal old and traditional scoring agencies. And obviously it's going to be even more the case for AI scoring, reporting type of systems, just because we don't even know that they are being collected in the context of credit scoring, right? So they'll be about, have you paid your Amazon bill? Then maybe that works. But what type of friend do you have on Facebook? Typos, what kind of music do you listen to, et cetera, et cetera. So sure, there is a problem of sloppy data. So it's good to ask for quality of data sets, but will data ever be free of errors? And then what's going to be the benchmark for the problematic data, right? What's going to be the benchmark for historical bias or for noisy data? So I am not so happy in terms of, I would like to see more. The same for transparency. Here, interestingly enough, really interesting, if you compare it to the US scoring systems, the transparency which the Commission proposal asks for is transparency between the developer of the AI system and the user. So in our world, the user would usually be the credit scoring agency or maybe the lender. But it's not the end person, right? And so again, in the credit scoring context, if we look to the S, we see explainability as a key issue. You want to be explained why you don't get the credit, and you want to get a reason for why you didn't get it. So what about explainability for the scored person? We're not seeing it. We're only seeing explainability to the entity which is using the AI system itself. So is this going to help the scoring issue, or is the fact that the EU Commission has, for whichever reason, and I'm really curious to find out, picked credit scoring, AI credit scoring, as one of the specifically listed high-risk AI cases? Is this just maybe not a good decision? Lastly, human oversight. Again, human oversight is one of the typical remedies legal scholars look to when they're trying to come to grips with AI. And again, yes, the human in the loop can be important and can help. For example, if we're talking about sloppy data, it might be good if you have the possibility to appeal to someone and say, listen, this or that seems to be wrong, but this presupposes so much. The explainability from the previous slide, it presupposes that I understand what went wrong with my data. So the human in the loop, it can be important, but it can also offer false comfort. So there's a risk of rubber stamping, just having this one guy check, yes, next one, check. Then there's automation bias, which actually the proposal talks about. There's tons of empirical papers about the question, what happens, and that's health area, legal area, whichever, what happens if you have the decider fed with the result of what the AI said, And then the decider needs to say, either I accept it or I challenge it. And so automation bias, often people tend to say, well, if the AI came up with that, that will be okay. So does it really help? We don't know. And in that same vein, responsibility diffusion, maybe I'll just be happy to sign off that example and say, yes, of course, if the AI said he gets a bad score, it's going to be the case. So lastly, the policy suggestion, please, so to speak, clarify the benchmark for risks to fundamental rights. I really think it's not the same category. It's one thing if we're talking about health and safety. It's deeply different if we're talking about fundamental human rights, both from the technical point of view and also from the legal point of view. It's a vague term and can't be compared in any meaningful way. So either we throw it all out or there's dire need to clarify what they're talking about. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now I'm back with a stable internet connection, hopefully. I'm looking forward to opening the Q&A with the question. Like, we saw that there are several regulatory challenges in relation to also like data collection, protection, and data subjects' rights. If we, for example, take the right to be forgotten, does it apply to data fed into the machine learning system, or like how would this affect the outcome?
Yeah, and that's a good question. It's especially a good question in the credit scoring context, because people would not want to forget that you didn't pay back a loan, right? And interestingly, that's such a good question, because it's a question about what rights do you have as an end borrower, right? But this is not what the proposal does. They just say, we are going to build these three categories, prohibited, high risk, or so to speak, normal. And that's it. And then we'll come up with these requirements, and there's nothing in it, so to speak, for the concerned person, in that sense, for the borrower, in my case, and all the others, which are kind of at the end of the chain, which I think makes the proposal, I don't know, there's kind of an intellectual flaw in the proposal in that respect. And it's also, of course, makes us unhappy, because we don't, nothing happens in the end, right? They're pointing at risks, but they don't give us rights.
Yeah. Then we have also two questions in the chat so far, from Deborah Webster. Human rights are basic rights every human being should have, but given the power and potential of AI, shouldn't we be aiming beyond rights?
Ensure rights and aim for human. Well, sure, I can only say sure. That's what we should do, and that's why I'm so unhappy with the proposal, because it's taking, at its outset, it's talking about rights, and it's putting rights in the same category as health and safety. But then it's not giving us anything. Interestingly enough, the explainability example, right? So a traditional scoring agency would tell me, okay, listen, you didn't pay back your loans, you don't have assets, you don't have income. This is why I can't give you a good score. I understand this. I go home and I decide to either change something about it if I'm able to, or I don't. If I'm now being scored on the basis of big data, we use this catch-all phrase, I don't even know what people are looking for. And I don't even know, even if I knew what they will be looking for, I don't know what this is going to say about me. Classic example is one scoring agency looking for what type of font can they find on my electronic device. There was a German setup, and they found a correlation between one really specific font and people not being able to pay back their loans. They didn't know why, and they didn't care. They were just afraid. We have this one variable, it kills everything. And in the end, it turned out that this font was used by an online gambling site, so it sort of makes sense. But for me, as the end consumer, I have no idea what I'm opening myself up to, and I have no rights to ask, to be explained to consent, which is a key data privacy issue. So As I say, so that they're talking about it and they're starting from there, but they don't giving us any food, so to speak. And yes, I see Deborah Webster saying would apply to recruiting use cases. Absolutely. It's the same problem. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
With regard to the time, I would now thank you very much for your insights and the interesting presentation. We're now coming to our,
I'm looking forward to
you can also clap on Zoom, I think. We're now coming to our second presenter, Ben Green. Welcome. And Ben Green is a postdoctoral scholar in the Michigan Society of Fellows and an assistant professor in the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. And he studies the social and political impacts of government algorithms with a focus on algorithm fairness, smart cities, and the criminal justice system. And he will now give us some insights in the limits of human oversight.
Well, thanks so much, Margarita, for the intro. And I think this talk will follow very nicely from Katja's presentation, particularly one of the final slides talking about the limits of human oversight. This will pick up and focus specifically on that point. So let me just, now that I have the screen sharing, you should be able to see slides and not my notes. And yes, so yeah, the key point that I want to make in this talk is that regulations, including the AI Act, but beyond, sort of across the world, are increasingly calling for human oversight as a protective measure for the algorithms used by government agencies. And yet, when you actually look at really all of the empirical evidence about how people use automation and algorithms in particular, they're actually unable to reliably provide the types of protections that all of these regulations suppose. And instead, when you look at the effect of these provisions, human oversight tends really to simply legitimize the use of flawed and unaccountable algorithms by government agencies. And so ultimately, we need to come up with a more rigorous approach to determining when and how government should be allowed to incorporate algorithms into their decision-making processes. And the draft paper on which this is based is available online on SSRN. So if you want more of the details and the citations and all of that, check there or shoot me an email. So obviously the onset of algorithmic decision-making in government has brought significant debate and controversy. On the one hand, these tools bring the promise of accuracy and fairness and consistency in decision-making. And yet, of course, much of the reporting that's been done has shown that these algorithms are the source of numerous injustices related to errors and biases and inflexibility of the mechanisms of these algorithms. And so these competing hopes and fears about algorithmic decision-making have led regulatory bodies across the world to propose mechanisms for how governments can attain the benefits of algorithms while avoiding the risks of algorithmic decision-making. And so one of the primary mechanisms that has emerged across the world is human oversight. In other words, saying that we must require a human to somehow, in some form, oversee the algorithm and make a final decision rather than the algorithm operating fully autonomously. And we can see a couple examples of this. Human oversight is presented as being able to alleviate the risks of government algorithms. In the AI Act, the European Commission writes that for high-risk systems, human oversight, among other remedies, is strictly necessary to mitigate the risks to fundamental rights and safety posed by AI. And because of this belief in the benefits of human oversight, many policies essentially make human oversight a condition of making it allowable for governments to use algorithms. One example of this is in the Canadian Directive on Automated Decision-Making, where the government writes that if a decision is likely to have high or very high social impacts, it cannot be made without having a specific human intervention points during the decision-making process, and the final decision must be made by a human. And so in theory, adopting algorithms while ensuring human oversight could enable governments to obtain the best of both worlds, the accuracy, objectivity, and consistency of algorithms paired with the individualized and contextual discretion of human decision-making. But despite the emphasis on that legislators have placed on human oversight, there's been very little evaluation of the actual sort of functional quality of these policies. We're left with this question of, do human oversight policies actually work, which is quite vital to ensure given the central role that they are playing in emerging regulations. Because if these regulations are not grounded in evidence supporting their efficacy, we may instead have the perverse effect where human oversight policies alleviate scrutiny of government algorithms, but don't actually address the underlying concerns that make us cautious of deploying these tools in the first place. So in this paper, I did a survey of a bunch of different policies around the world, including proposed and passed legislation, sort of official policy guidance documents, and then as more of a case study, specific manuals and policies related to risk assessments used in the criminal justice system and in child welfare cases in the United States. And so from surveying a number of many different policies, I found 40 that prescribe different forms of human oversight. And there are really 3 different approaches that these policies take. And so I'll run through first what these 3 approaches are, and then I'll turn to the evaluation of how these approaches fare. So the first approach is perhaps the one we're most familiar with. It's what is taken by the GDPR, for instance, which is about restricting or prohibiting solely automated decisions. The GDPR writes that the data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing. And these sorts of provisions now exist in many bills across the world, many of them which are rather close derivatives to the GDPR, which create a default prohibition against solely automated processing. And then in cases where solely automated decisions are allowed, subjects are granted a variety of protections. The most notable of these is the right to obtain post hoc human or review of a decision that was made by an algorithm. So in sum, the first approach says that solely automated decisions are prohibited by default, and where allowed, subjects should have the right to human intervention. The second approach is really a corollary to the first approach. It says that we should emphasize human discretion and ensure that humans are making the final decision. A couple of examples of this are in manuals and documents and policies related to risk assessments used in the United States, where the managers of these tools write, for instance, that staff should be encouraged to use their professional judgment and override the computed risk as appropriate, and reassuring publics that screening decisions are not in any way dictated by the algorithm. Call screening supervisors have full discretion over call screening decisions, regardless of the generated risk scores. And so this approach really takes the idea of the first approach and makes it a little bit more affirmative around saying that governments may use algorithms as long as human decision makers have discretion to override the algorithm and make the final decision. And finally, the third approach is really an extension of the second approach, where rather than simply saying that people must have discretion to make the decision, these policies really emphasize the need for meaningful human input and involvement. And I think this is where this third approach is what some of the most recent policies and proposals, including the AI Act, fall into. We can see, for instance, in the Article 29 Data Protection Working Party's guidance related to the GDPR, they write that to qualify as human involvement, the controller must ensure that any oversight of the decision is meaningful rather than just a token gesture. And in these various policies calling for meaningful human input, there's not a specific definition of what meaningful human input involves, but there are three sets of recommendations that are made that sort of create a coherent or create a set of requirements potentially for meaningful human input, which is that human decision makers should be able to override the algorithm. They should be able to understand the algorithm with typical mechanisms such as explanations and transparency. And then finally, should avoid relying too heavily on algorithms. So to summarize approach 3, it says that governments may use algorithms as long as human decision makers have meaningful input and oversight. So now I want to turn to evaluating all of these policies. And the main argument of my work here is that these policies suffer from two pretty fundamental flaws, even in spite of the rather intuitive appeal that human oversight policies have. So the first flaw is that human oversight policies have a quite meager basis in empirical evidence. So I'm going to run through the three different approaches that I just described and describe how each of them really have no basis in empirical and experimental evidence suggesting that they actually are capable of providing the types of protections that regulators might want. So the issues with solely automated decision regulations are sort of the most straightforward. And increasingly, many people have already pointed those out with respect to the GDPR. The first is that there's a rather limited scope, that even today, most of the most controversial algorithms that are used do not actually operate autonomously. There already is a human in the loop, so to speak. And so these provisions wouldn't really apply in some of the cases that have garnered the most controversy. And then also, as Katja mentioned, there's also a sort of relatively straightforward loophole to these policies, at least as written in law, quite literally, which is that if there's really any nominal or relatively minimal form of human involvement, that decision would no longer qualify as being solely automated. And so that rather strict threshold means that it can be quite easy for government agencies to escape the regulations. And even the right to post hoc human intervention, I don't think is really of particular benefit. Procedurally, this would require individuals to request review after they have already suffered from a decision made about them, and obtaining remedies could be quite difficult. It could be quite time consuming. So it's really not a great way of addressing these issues. And then substantively, human review is unlikely to actually produce better decisions in a reliable way. And I'm going to talk about that sort of in this next section. So even when we move from minimal rubber stamp approaches to human oversight, such that people are actually granted agency and discretion, human oversight is still unlikely to provide protections against the harms of algorithmic decision making. There's lots of evidence demonstrating that many types of automated decision support systems can alter human decision making in unexpected and detrimental ways. The most notable of these is automation bias. But even in more recent years, there's a great deal of new evidence from research over the last really just 3 or 4 years, demonstrating that people are quite bad at judging the quality of algorithmic outputs and determining when to override those outputs. And so people's judgments about whether an algorithmic prediction is accurate and whether and how they should override or diverge from an algorithmic recommendation, those judgments are often incorrect and biased. And so rather than being able to identify errors and correct for biased predictions, human oversight is not able to do that and may in fact inject new types of errors and new types of biases into the process. And then even when we turn to ideas of meaningful human oversight, we still don't see any real improvements in outcomes that this form of oversight might be able to produce. So first, there's a bit of a definitional issue, which is that there's no clear meaning or no clear definition to what meaningful human oversight entails, right? What makes human oversight meaningful? It's quite vague. And that could be okay since many policies can appropriately lack a very specific definition, but there should be at least some clear standard and, more importantly, some evidence that any of the components that would fall under that standard of meaningful human oversight actually improve outcomes. And yet the problem is that each of the three components of meaningful human oversight that I described earlier are actually unlikely to improve decision-making and are very difficult to achieve. So the first principle was that people should be able to override algorithms. Well, that's already the case, but as I described on the previous slide, people are not actually good at overriding algorithms in ways that mitigate mistakes and biases. The second principle was that people should understand the algorithm through explanations and transparency, but recent studies have shown that presenting people with explanations or more transparent forms of algorithms doesn't actually improve their ability to perform various tasks of human oversight, such as identifying errors. And then finally, even though we might want people to not rely too heavily on an algorithm, that's a very reasonable goal to have. It's actually quite difficult to get rid of issues like automation bias. And more recent work has shown that people also can have their decision-making processes altered by algorithms such that they're increasing attention to the factors emphasized by these tools, even if they're not relying on them entirely. So we now have this issue where the first flaw, that human oversight policies don't actually have a basis in evidence suggesting that they can work. And this leads to a more sort of difficult and challenging set of issues, which is that the result of having these policies that don't actually work is that human oversight policies serve primarily to legitimize flawed and unaccountable algorithms to be used by government agencies. And this operates in two primary ways. So the first is that human oversight provides a false sense of security in adopting algorithms. Many of the reasons that we want to have human oversight is because of concerns about the mistakes and biases and issues that we are increasingly aware that algorithms can have. And so we turn to human oversight to suggest that that will allow us to use these algorithms while protecting against the harms. One example of this is in a court case in the state of Wisconsin, which was about whether or not it was appropriate to use a risk assessment tool when sentencing a defendant. And the state court essentially determined that it was appropriate to use the tool as long as there was human oversight. They write that consideration of Compass is permissible. Reliance on Compass for the sentence imposed is not permissible. Adding that just as corrections staff should disregard risk scores that are inconsistent with other factors, we expect that circuit courts will exercise discretion when assessing a Compass risk score with respect to each individual defendant. So there's this idea that as long as the judge making a sentence is allowed to override the tool and does not wholly rely on the tool, it's appropriate to use. But the problem is that there's, as I was describing earlier, there's lots of evidence showing that simply the ability for judges to override the tool and use their discretion is unlikely to actually be effective. Judges often use their discretion to ignore risk assessments or override risk assessments in punitive and racially biased ways. And so ultimately, if the court would be uncomfortable with the tool altering decisions without human oversight, there's not really any clear evidence to suggest that they should be more comfortable with that with human oversight, or that human oversight at least gets rid of those fundamental issues. And so in effect, we see that human oversight can make it seem legitimate for governments to use algorithms, but fails to address the underlying concerns that about inaccurate and biased predictions. So, but rather than thinking that we actually maybe should simply not use this tool at all, we cover up those concerns with human oversight. And then the second issue, closely related to the first, is that human oversight diminishes accountability for institutional decision makers. We essentially, with human oversight policies, are shifting responsibility from the technology vendors and the government agencies that are structuring these algorithms onto the frontline human operators who are tasked with performing oversight. So one notable example of this phenomenon occurred with respect to the story about a man in the state of Michigan who was arrested due to an incorrect match by a facial recognition algorithm that was used by the Detroit Police Department. And several months after this happened, the police chief who was responsible for this system went on 60 Minutes, which is one of the sort of most notable news programs in the United States, and had this exchange with the journalist. Anderson Cooper says, "What happened in the case of Robert Williams, who was the man who was arrested? What went wrong?" James Craig responds, "Sloppy, sloppy investigative work. That detective was disciplined, and subsequently a commanding officer of that command has been de-appointed. But it wasn't facial recognition that failed. What failed was a horrible investigation." So what we have here is technology vendors and police leadership, including this police chief, who have decided to implement a facial recognition system, despite knowledge that facial recognition has many, is often quite inaccurate, particularly inaccurate when evaluating Black faces. Detroit is the most, has the highest proportion of Black residents in the United States. And yet when something goes wrong, the police chief is immediately blaming the investigation, talking about how the individuals involved were punished, and reaffirming that the algorithm is not what failed was the investigation. And so here is just one example of how human oversight positions frontline human operators as the scapegoats for the flaws of government algorithms, even though the harms of these systems are typically structured and determined by more powerful institutional actors, such as the technology vendors and the leaders of the government agencies using those systems. So the question then that I'll leave us with is what's the alternative? It's clear that policymakers should stop relying on human oversight as a central mechanism for protecting against the harms of government algorithms, but there's not an immediately clear response, right? We don't want to simply say, well, we should use algorithms without human oversight, let them run autonomously, nor should we say that we should abandon algorithms in government and never use them at all. And instead, we have to actually start a little bit more upstream and start from the broader structure of how are we going to determine whether and in what form it's appropriate to incorporate algorithms in government decision-making. So I'll just quickly preview that sort of ultimately where I come down in this is that one way to think about this is to create an alternative approach that operates in two stages, and that is meant to address the two flaws that I described earlier. So first, we really need to think more critically about whether an algorithm is actually suitable for a given decision, rather than thinking that we can use human oversight to cover up any issues with the algorithm or any issues that really it's a decision that shouldn't be made by algorithms. We really need to make those decisions of whether a tool should be used at all, and often realize that this is, certain decisions maybe are not appropriate for incorporating algorithms. And then second, in the cases where we think that it is appropriate to incorporate an algorithm, we need to be much more proactive about actually evaluating human oversight and human algorithm collaborations through various types of preliminary experiments. So just in the same way that increasingly we now have the requirement that vendors and agencies evaluate the accuracy of their algorithms, we should similarly be requiring that they evaluate the human interactions with their algorithms to ensure that there's evidence in support of whatever type of decision-making process is actually going to be implemented. So I will break there and look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Ben.
There we go.
Now it's working perfect. So Elliot, for example, had a question and is asking if the discretion laws are helping the decision subjects or decision makers or both.
So that's an interesting question. And I think that they are intended, the discretion laws are intended to help the decision subjects. The motivation that I see in putting these laws into place is to say that we should be protecting the subjects of decisions from being subject to automated decisions. There must be human discretion involved as a matter of due process and human rights. And if anything, I think it's in practice often, in some case, yeah, I think, and in general, it often, as I was describing, I think allows the decision makers, the specific frontline agents, to sort of become scapegoats and to become the agents of blame when something goes wrong. And I think in some ways, the people who might benefit the most from human oversight policies are the sort of higher level actors of agency leaders and technology vendors who have someone to blame when something goes wrong.
Thanks for that answer, Ben. There was one other question I asked that I think was the main one I wanted to get your response on, and it's related to this. Is in your framework, is AI or machine learning, is it different from like other technologies, like expert witnesses, like
All right, well, maybe I will respond to the extent of the question that I heard, right? Is this different from other technologies such as expert witnesses? Yeah, I think it would be worth looking into that more. I mean, there is evidence, or I've seen some research that judges, for instance, in court cases often will defer to expert witnesses and other types of technologies, even related to DNA tests and lie detector tests, much more than the sort of quality of these sources of information would suggest. So I do think there is a broader phenomenon happening here of how are we presenting different types of information and evidence, and sort of what the appropriate role for that should be. Of course, with things like expert witnesses, we at least have more existing protections in place where you can have typically, cross-examination or various ways of interrogating the authority and knowledge of those sources. And that's something that doesn't really exist with respect to algorithms. Even in some of the court cases that have happened, courts have said, we can't access this tool because it's protected by trade secrets claims. And yet we're going to proceed anyway and rely on its evidence, even without any significant ability to evaluate it. And so I think that's,
yeah.
Oh, sorry. And I think that that's then, again, something that we are, if you look at, for instance, the Wisconsin case, they're acknowledging that and really putting a lot on the human oversight components. And I think, again, yeah, we should be much more critical of, does this algorithm actually work? Because so many of the tools that are put into place really don't. There's lots of errors. There's often, as Katja was mentioning, sloppy data and bad engineering, and even the issues of trade secrecy claims that prevent us from being able to even perform those types of tests so that we can determine whether it's trustworthy.
Thank you.
Do we have any last questions from the audience? If this is not the case, then thank you very much, Katja and Ben, again for your presentation. And I'd also like to thank all participants and all your questions. And with this said, I will end today's workshop. Thanks again for coming, and I wish you a great evening.
Thank you, Margarita, for organizing this. This was really great.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Katja.
Bye.
Bye.